Okay, go ahead and get started now. Hello and welcome everyone to our panel discussion, Queering Archives, where we will be looking at LGBTIQ+ archives and archival practices in Houston and Berlin. My name is Grant Amond, and I'm the director of the Goethe Pop-Up Houston. This event is part of the series Queer as German Folk Goes Digital, which is presented by the Goethe Institute North America, the Goethe Pop-Ups in Seattle, Kansas City, and here in Houston, as well as the Schwules Museum Berlin. In addition to today's event, I encourage everyone to visit the digital exhibition Queer as German Folk at queerexhibition.org to give sort of a bigger context from our discussion today. Today also marks the first day of our German queer documentary film series. Each weekend in September, we're presenting a documentary film which can be screened for free. This weekend, we're screening the documentary Audre Lorde, The Berlin Years. For more information on all of our events in our Queer as German Folk series, you can visit our website or find us on Facebook or Instagram, the links for which I will post in the chat. Today's panel features Dr. Peter Rehberg, Head of Archive and Collections at the Schwules Museum Berlin, Lara Ledva, Gender Studies Scholar and Researcher at the Spinnboden Lesbian Archive and Library Berlin, Harrison Guy, founder of the Charles Law Community Archive and at the African American Library at the Gregory School in Houston, and Emily Vinson, audiovisual archivist and curator at the University of Houston Libraries. Our conversation today will be moderated by Dr. Brian Riedel, who is the Associate Director for the Center for the Study of Women, Gender, and Sexuality at Rice University. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Brian. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Grant. And thank you to the Goethe Institute, specifically Grant and Katie Bruton, for helping to pull this event together. We at the Center for the Study of Women, Gender, and Rice, Sexuality at Rice are very honored to be supporting this event. I also want to thank our four panelists for preparing to share with us today, and to you all, our audience, for joining us and your interest in this work. So first, a brief word about what are we doing? Queer archives embody a timeless lesson. Knowledge is power. Knowledge about the queer past and present help us to imagine both queer and other futures better. And securing the resources to tell our own stories about ourselves has been a central task in efforts to sustain queer life and achieve justice around the world. But putting queer and archive together can mean a lot of things. We could be talking about content. Does the archive contain evidence of queer life? We could also mean an origin story. Regardless of what is in the archive, do the people who originally collect the material identify as queer, or even build the collection toward a queer purpose? We could mean staffing. Are the people who sustain and curate an archive queer? We could also mean method. Do those who run the archive go about doing that work in an unconventional or queer way? And we might also mean the users themselves. Regardless of how a collection is brought together, preserved, or curated, those who use it can find their own queer angle of approach, potentially making any archive queer. And around the globe, we now see a stunning array of queer archives, from passionate individual collectors and scrappy grassroots organizations to well-established institutions and collaborative ventures that link communities, libraries, museums, universities, and governments. And in just a moment, you'll get to hear a small slice of that array through the four panelists whose archival labor here spans continents and cultures. But first, a bit of housekeeping. Our program will start with a moment for each of our four panelists to introduce themselves and the archives with which they work. Then we'll have a conversation among the panelists around some key questions for queer archiving today. Then we'll open up the conversation for a moderated question and answer session. We'd like to use the chat for sharing information and links during the program, but at any point during the program, please feel free to send questions to us through the Q&A function. We'll do our best to get to as many of your questions as we can, and we may combine some questions in order to do so. So I'm very pleased to turn the screen over to our four panelists to introduce themselves and their work, beginning with Peter.
Hi, well, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm happy to join this conversation about queer archives. I'm also very happy that the Goethe Institute features the work of Schwules Museum so prominently with the exhibition, now with the online exhibition, and with, producing all these occasions to talk about our collection and our work. Just a few words about myself. By training, I'm an academic. I've worked in academia, mostly in the United States, actually, many years with a degree from NYU. I worked in Texas, in Austin, Texas for 5 years in the German department on a DRD position. So while my training is in German studies, philosophy and art history, my research ever since graduation is mostly on queer and gender issues, and also more specifically on visual culture and popular culture. For example, last year I've published a book called Hipster Porn, Queer Masculinities and Affective Sexualities in the Fanzine But, which will also, it's published in German, but it's going to come out in English next year with Routledge. So there will be an English version of it as well. But let me talk a little bit about my work at Schwules Museum. So I've been appointed head of collections and archives a little bit over 2 years ago. Let's just talk a little bit about the archive and the nature, the character of our archive of Schwules Museum. I guess one of the specificities of our institution is actually that we are both a museum space, an exhibition space, and an archive, which is not always the case. Many queer archives don't have an exhibition space like we do. We also are quite significant as a place for events, for lecture series, for talks, for all kinds of queer political events. So we have several functions, and the archive is really just one of them. I mean, it's certainly one of the pillars of the institution, but it's always, what's always at stake is the interaction of the archive with the other parts of our institution. For example, how much of the collection is presented in the exhibition spaces? Is the history and the constituency of our collection working? Does it fit with our interests in creating a public? For example, do we have enough objects of all the queer topics that we actually do want to address and exhibit? Our collection is quite diverse in terms of material and media. We collect documents, photographs, posters, buttons, postcards, art, 3D objects, and other things. Just to give you an idea about the status of our collection, or also what we are capable of and what we're perhaps not capable of, we are almost entirely based on donations. So as head of collections, I don't have a budget to acquire things. Sometimes we can if we apply for outside funding, but really 98% of what we have in the basement is from donations. We belong to one of the larger queer archives, globally speaking. It's impossible to give a number. One of the numbers that is circulating in our conversations is 1.5 million objects, maybe approximately, in our collection. What's also, I think, an interesting information is that only about 10% of our holdings are actually inventoried and processed. So most of the things are really boxes with just, the name of the donor on it. And of course, at one point, someone has had a look into this box, but we cannot know, we don't really know in detail what's in it. This is just the case for 10% or so of our collection, which is also to say only that percentage can be accessed through a database and can be made available to researchers in our institutions. Our work is, we have about 10 people or so working in the institution part-time. Most of the work is still done by volunteers. We have about 60, 70 volunteers working for the whole of the museum. And also maybe just, a few numbers. So we have individual bequests to topics or like GDR or Nazi Germany, things like that. But we also have a vast, what we call thematic collection with about 3,000 to 4,000 keywords. So you can also just look up a keyword, a name, a country, some sort of institution, and we would have something about it, quite often magazine or newspaper clips. Maybe just a last comment on the history of the institution. It was founded 35 years ago in 1985. It all started with an exhibition at the then so-called Berlin Museum named El Dorado, which was the place of a famous queer nightclub in the 1920s in Berlin. Back then in '85, this was a gay and lesbian exhibition. However, the museum that was founded 1 year after the exhibition back then was a gay male only institution. This is due to, say, separatist politics in the 1980s. In the course of its history, the Schwules Museum, it's still called Schwules Museum, Gay Museum. And there's obviously also debate about this, keeping the name or replacing the name. However, in the past 35 years, we had several processes and waves of extending our scope and becoming more inclusive, particularly in the past 10 years to be an archive and a museum and an event place for all queer groups.
Great. Thank you very much, Peter. Laura.
Yes, hello. Also, thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. I'm Lara. I'm working part-time at the Spinnboden Lesbian Archives and Library. And first, I would like to tell you something about the history of the archives. It was founded almost already 50 years ago, so in 1973, but it was kind of unofficially because it was by a lesbian activist group. It was one of the first Western German lesbian activist groups of that time, and they decided for political organizing to compile all the minutes of the future meetings, to keep record of what did we do, what do we want to do, what did we already discuss. And then they also started a newspaper cutting of lesbian issues in all the big newspapers. They paid an organization to do it. So that was like the unofficial start. And then the collection of the group, so it was all the minutes, and newspapers always wandered from like home to home. And it was also called a love story archive back then because it was like moving with starting and ending of relationships between the lesbians. So it's also quite sweet and intimate. And in the 80s, actually the group was dissolving because of some separatist and political issues. And one woman, Gudrun Schwarz, she found the whole collection and put it in her home, and then started or set up like a proper lesbian archive with other women, and they officially opened in 1982 then, and it was for many years in the home of that woman, and then she also had to move herself because it was getting bigger and bigger. Yes, and in our archive or there we are collecting all by and about lesbians and lesbian lives, which we have a very complex and diverse definition of, but maybe we can also talk about it later. Yes, and today actually it's kind of some parallels also to the archive of Schwules Museum, but we only have 2 part-time paid, yeah, or only 2 people are paid for their work, and the other staff is only on a volunteer basis. Then we have some honorary staff, and of course also the board members, because we are an association. Yeah, and we are also quite dependent on donations by the community. We also don't have any funds to buy something, or also not many resources to actively go out and search. Yeah, and I guess one characteristic for us is also that we are quite a community So we also host a lot of groups, like coming out groups, groups to go out, research groups about lesbian or queer history. Then we also have some workshops or events for writing, for example, or theater. Yeah, so it's always like partly this archive and library, but partly also like a place to come together and to connect the community. And yeah, maybe about the name Spinnboden, because I guess it's not that evident in English. It's like it's a German term for a place or a room where women historically spun wool on spinning wheels. And the founders of the archive thought it's quite nice because there was like this oral exchange of histories. So they wanted to be in that tradition, and we also still kept that name. There were also discussions about it, also about the term lesbian or not. So it's also like some parallels there. Yeah, and about myself, I studied gender studies. I live in Berlin, and I wrote my thesis about the activist group who founded the art. And in my work, I tried to look at, from a queer feminist theoretical perspective, on what, like, how did they organize in the 70s, and which like political moves are still very valuable for today, alliance oriented, and which separatist politics also were kind of like maybe, or today you could criticize them because it was too separatist and not like helpful to build a community. Yeah, so that's about myself.
Thank you, Laura. Harrison?
Hello. Thank you so much for having me. I'm representing the Charles Law Community Archive, and I was a little hesitant to be here today because the Charles Law Archive is still so very new, and archiving period is very new for me and my community, and the learning curve is there. But I'm very happy to be here and share our process and what's going on with the archive. So Dr. Charles Law is an African-American gay man who in his time was an activist here in Houston, and I came to his name. I was speaking at an event that was to memorialize the 49 people that had been murdered in the Pulse Massacre. And after giving my speech, someone told me that my speech reminded them of Charles Law and asked if I knew who that was. And I knew who he was because I had seen him on a banner project here in Houston, and I heard his name in some of the religious circles. So I knew who he was, but not really. And so after the person told me I had to know this person and I should definitely know more about this person, that was Brian, our facilitator today, introduced me to a deeper knowledge of Charles Law and just made it very, made me very aware that this is someone that I should know, who was a part of my history and heritage. And after learning about him, I deeply connected to his life. There are lots of similarities to the way we navigated both the LGBT community, the Black community, and it just felt like, you know, like he was me and I was him. And so I'm so thankful for Brian for pushing me in that direction. And so that's where the name just stuck with me. And I just thought this is a person who should be honored in Houston. He spoke in 1979 at the March on Washington for LGBTQ rights, and was just a dynamic speaker and an amazing person. So I just thought how we would pay homage to this person, and knew I always wanted to do something to honor him. And so I kept that kind of in my mind, and I'm a big fan of the African American Library. I'm always there researching, and I think I went through every book there and noticed that there was not a Black LGBTQ anything on the shelves, not even from James Baldwin. And I thought that that was a standout reason for me to have a conversation with the director. I went to the director and I said, I noticed you don't have any Black LGBTQ literature or anything that I would say specific to that beyond some essays that are in books that are about Black life, but not Black LGBTQ life, and suggested that we add some of those books that conversation led to a conversation of just absence, and that the fact that there was not a lot of Black LGBTQ things, period, even within their archive, and not a lot of Black LGBTQ people coming to do archiving for themselves, their organizations. And that's when I said, aha, this is the thing. This is how we're going to honor Dr. Charles Law. And so I decided to found this archive in his name, and to really figure out how we could go back and unpeel some of the layers that have covered up the history and heritage of Black LGBTQ people locally here in Houston. And so that's kind of where the idea came from. And so I've honestly been very nervous but anxious at the same time, and excited about this project, because archiving is something that Black people don't do just, it's just not a part of what we do, or we do it differently and call it something else. It's not very organized. And so this is a really big piece of the puzzle of why things are missing in broader histories for Black LGBTQ people. And so that responsibility is a bit overwhelming for me, but it's been exciting. And so I kept looking for signs that we're on the right path. And the very first acquisition we got was a wheelchair from Barbara Jordan. It's the wheelchair she used to use when she was a board member at Chase Bank. And I thought, that's the first thing I got. Okay, well, perhaps I'm on the right path. And then the next thing I got was a magazine. It's the only physical copy of a Black LGBTQ magazine that was here in Houston. It was really small, but big to me, called Sapiens Magazine. And so starting to collect things like that let me know that they didn't live anywhere, that they were not housed anywhere, and that these things should definitely be documented. And so from there, we just have started to do archiving. And what I like about this particular archive is it is both at a legacy archiving institution and it's a community archive. So we're doing both at the same time, where the community, really can drive a lot of what we keep and then what we put into the archive. And so I like that duality and those things being parallel to one another. And so clubs and nightclubs and bars are really important in the LGBT community, we all know. More specifically in the Black community, that is our havens. And so we started to develop a list and asking questions: what bars have existed? And we've come up with 32, and people off the top of their head would say 3, that they know of. But once you start digging, you start getting all these things, and that led us to say, can we find their logos? Can we recreate their logos, perhaps for an exhibition? So I love that we're unpeeling all of this, and it's giving us all these ideas and just giving honor, to these stories to Black LGBTQ Houston. And now we're kind of looking at, how do we one of the kind of challenges I think with this particular archive is that, Black people are very relational, and we are also very, we take our information and we don't share it easily sometimes, and that you can understand that's by way of society, right? And there's no difference with archiving. I've spent, the archive was founded February the 21st in 2019. So it's taken me that long to even get people to commit. They haven't given me things yet, but it's taken that long for them just to promise me that they will turn over pictures and they would turn over documents. And so the difference with this particular archive that I'm learning from other archives that I'm seeing is that often some other cultures are very excited to have their things in an archive, where here there's just a little bit of hesitancy, and it takes some relationship building, and that has kind of made the process move at the pace of trust. And so that's a little different for this particular archive, but I'm very excited about where the archive is going, and just to really pay homage again to this rich legacy of things that happened in Houston. And the last thing I'll probably say about it is that the other uncovering is that Black people are not always wanting to be out about their sexuality. And so that double-edged sword of racism plus sexuality also allows people to not want pictures to come to the archive, and there's another element there of why things don't exist, because they had to be in the shadows and in the cracks. And so all of those kind of layers are very important to the specificity of this archive. But as you probably can feel, I'm excited and nervous and happy and anxious all at the same time just to start this. And I lied. There's one more thing I should probably say. It is a Houston archive, but we got lots of attention because this type of archive does not exist. We get lots of attention from other people who saying, will you take this? and it's not related to Houston, but I'm still going to say yes because it's probably related in some way. And so that's another thing, is just that the void of these types of archives in other cities have led people to say maybe they don't want to start one, but would we be responsible to hold their things as well?
Great. Thank you very much, Harrison. Emily.
Yeah, thank you again for inviting me to be part of this talk. My background is in audiovisual archives, so I come from a little bit of a different background, but I'll talk about why I'm here in a moment. I'm at the University of Houston, which is a fairly large university archive that collects materials related both to the history of the university and to the Houston area. And starting, I think about 6 or 7 years ago, my colleague Vince Lee began the LGBT history collection, and has been quite successful, and that collection's grown tremendously over the years. And then how I sort of am involved is this summer we received a significant grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities for a 3-year project to support the digitization and transcription of 40 years of Houston LGBT queer radio and television programming. And so these recordings were produced by and for the queer community, very local to Houston. They aired on a local public broadcast, or a public radio station, community radio station, and a cable channel. And these programs might generally be described as kind of news and culture, and then sort of a chat format. And they include many notable Houston activists and politicians, and then the coverage of almost any significant event that happened either in Houston or nationally. So a lot of like kind of very important examples of what the community was talking about at any given time, going back to the 70s, you know, particularly when there were very significant silences about the AIDS crisis in mainstream broadcasting. It was being discussed by these folks. The programming also demonstrates a pretty unique, unique examples of like intersectionality. So there were lots of specialized segments for different sort of groups within the LGBT and queer communities. So it's very exciting that we're going to be having sort of access for the first time in a long time to these recordings. They come from both collections held by the University of Houston, donated by J.D. Doyle, who I know is on the call today, who's a community archivist, and Russ Bird, who was part of the team that produced the television show that we are digitizing, as well as a non-custodial partnership with the Gulf Coast Archive and Museum of Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual, and Transgender History, which is another community archive. So all told, there are thousands of hours of recordings, and this project was largely driven by a need for access, because they're all everything from open reel tape, cassette tape, CDs, a strange era when they were recording audio on VHS tape, and then production videos for the television program. And then a really significant concern that if we didn't digitize these sort of very soon, they might not be accessible in the near future. So that was really what drove the decision to run the project. And then also the larger sense of accessibility, part of the grant is going to be to have transcriptions of all of these recordings. So they'll both be accessible to those with hearing impairments, but also a level of keyword searchability, and like sort of creating them as like almost, or accessing them as almost data sets that is, I think, fairly unique and has some like really exciting research opportunities for the right researcher. So those are kind of the highlights of the project. And then of course, we have some challenges. So there's commercial music, and there are BBC news breaks that we're going to have to extract before the online publication. All of those will be preserved as part of the main recording that's held by the archive and can be heard in the library space. Especially interesting because of the music, because a lot of this music might not have been commercial. I think there was a trend of people mailing their demo tape into the show, and particularly if they're part of the queer community, it might have been featured. So, you know, they're very important recordings, but legally there's limitations for what we can publish online. So, but after all of that's said and done, they will be available online for access. And of course, I just have to really thank the partners and donors that have made this immense project possible. which is our granting agency, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and then J.D. Doyle, Rusbird, and the Gulf Coast Archives and Museum. That's it for me.
Thank you very much, Emily. And as we all can hear, putting these 4 brief presentations of pretty large projects together, the issues that we have to talk about are legion, from intersectionality to how volunteers work to how metadata makes things available to people. And all of us are at different levels of that kind of conversation. So for now, though, what we would like to do is to focus the conversation through a few areas. And the first of them is really kind of hidden in the name of the panel itself today. We're talking about both queer archives and queering archives. So an adjective and a process, I guess. And so they can be about queer lives, but are not always run by queer people. And at the same time, there's queer ways to go about doing the work that we're doing. That might be, I think Harrison used a really powerful phrase of doing archives differently and calling it something else, right? So how would you say that your institution or collection speaks to those ideas of the queer archive and then queering archives? Any one of you, feel free to jump in.
I can start. I can say, make 2 or 3 points maybe. One thing I would like to come back to is something that Harrison already mentioned when we are thinking about the queering of the archive and the queer archive from the position of Schwules Museum. One of the questions is, how do you turn a gay male archive into a more inclusive space? And this has a lot to do with networking, with personal contacts, with creating trust. I mean, after all, giving your belongings to an archive is a very, intimate and confident gesture, right? So there's a lot of stake here for people. Also, in a sense, in an imaginary sense of an afterlife or legacy or a history that will still be written. So the stakes are high, and that also means it's not always easy to persuade people to give their stuff to you. So that's one of the things I wanted to come back to, because I think that's probably in different ways the case for several queer groups and the relationship to the archive and the institution that it is. But I also want to say maybe 1 or 2 things about queering the archive as a process or as an activity, and maybe want to give 2 examples, because on a certain level it has to do with a very specific activity and work of cataloging work. So the question is, what language, what kind of queer language are you using for your inventory? Are you using a queer language? Are you using a gay and lesbian language? Are you using an intersectional language? So all these vocabularies have, of course, their own politics and their own historicity. So how do we, and I can just phrase this as a challenge or a question, how can we do justice to the legacy of the history that is represented? Let's just say a term like non-binary didn't exist until, I don't know, maybe a decade or 2, and has been circulating much more in the past couple of years. So how can we make connections? Is it legitimate? Is it necessary to make connections between, say, the archive of the representations of the sissy boy or the butch dyke and non-binary positions, right? And the same is the case, for example, for trans. Do we understand cross-dressing as a prehistory to trans? And that's obviously also a political discussion within the trans community itself. So some of these questions about queering are really also, in a sense, both cultural but technical questions of the instruments of the archive. Just a very last remark, as we know, queer theory has put a lot of emphasis on different ways of knowing and different methods of researching. So that not just what we know and about whom we know, but also how we know is a question of queerness. Important here is, of course, for example, in Cvetkovich's work on an archive of feelings. So, and this is a very complex matter. Maybe just one thing I do want to say is how we try to take into account also alternative forms of knowing that the archive is not just a place for, say, researchers of history or politics or social movement, but it's also a place for artists. For example, so we invite artists, or we offer grants to artists to work with our archive and to come up with artistic responses to our holdings. One example that we're working on right now is on a bar, on a cabaret, really in West Berlin called Chez Nous, which again, brings up the question: can we think of this as a part of trans culture, or is it really a different paradigm of thinking about gender diversity and sexual diversity? And so to have an artist look at the material of the history of that bar from the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s and produce an installation that creates an access to the history through other categories, through identification, through affective bonds, through aesthetic pleasure, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, so just a couple of preliminary thoughts on, the queer archive, but also the queering of the archive.
Great. What thoughts are you all having?
I can talk a little bit about kind of the notion of, there are a couple of notions of queering that comes to mind for me with the Charles Law Archive. The biggest one for me is really queering the notion of what is Black history. And so this legacy institution that was, that's been open for years to not have queer presence after all those years speaks directly to that. Bringing this topic, bringing this identity forefront to this institution is an idea of queering. And because it is an idea of queering, there's a tension there, right? There's this idea of, there's a reason why it's not here. We're much more comfortable with Black history and not necessarily expanding that in a way. And so I can remember when I brought the idea to the library, I remember the director and the staff it's the perfect staff for something like this, because I couldn't even get the question out before they said yes. So they were so welcoming and wanting this to be here, but we also had a really good conversation about what this means for their supporters, the people that are always at the library, being a highly religious, highly elderly community, that this has been coined as their space. And so there would be some tension there with, now saying that queer topics are not going to be niche. They're going to go out to everyone who's on this distribution list to say, this is Pride Month and we're celebrating Pride Month. And so that notion of just bringing that identity to the forefront to say, this is a part of this institution as well, is a really big notion of queering. I mean, the library, the archive itself hosted several Pride events at the library. When I was Pride Grand Marshal for our parade here, the staff bought shirts with my name on it and Charles Law Community Archive on the back. They were at the parade. They passed the shirts out to community, gave them away. They wanted to be a part of the festivities. And this year, if we had a parade, they were going to have a float in the parade. And so they're very interested in making sure that it is not something that's separate. And that idea alone is really, really a queering of how this institution has worked in the past. And I'll be honest and say they're driving this probably faster than I am, with wanting to make sure it's very clear that this is an identity that is a part of our history. So I see a queering there. I also see a queering in the way that Houston has established LGBTQ history. It's not a secret that the history that you look up is void of Black people. And that's for a lot of reasons that I named earlier, and the time that it takes to uncover it and find it. And so also saying to that notion of what's already established as what is Houston LGBTQ history, to say, no, there are other people, there's something missing. This isn't the whole story. And so to me, that's an idea of kind of queering the notion of what we've already established to be what LGBTQ history is in Houston. And then of course the identities itself, it's all about queer people. More specifically, one of the areas that I'm very interested in with this archive is an intergenerational approach, because archives can be very much so thought of as things for older people. And so we look at often, how do we bring young people into this? How do we start young people to say, you have things you could bring? We also want to know what's going on now. We want to document. We want to start now to correct what we didn't do, 40 years ago, and start doing that now. And so having these conversations where the idea of archiving becomes just second nature to us, making sure we're documented and making sure people understand, our lives. I think the way we do this archive is a bit of querying as well. Like I said, calling it, something else. Nostalgia is a word we use a lot. History and heritage versus archive is a word we use a lot. Black history is a word we use a lot, because a lot of Black people get excited about Black History Month, and that's something they can relate to versus an archive. And so just thinking about language a lot has really been important. And how do we make the language more comfortable, make the language more something that's more accessible to people that we want to accept this. And also querying, bringing the idea of, that when you say African American library, people sit up, like they think that's a big deal, right? And how do we then say, no, this is a horizontal approach to archiving, where it's not really that we're on a pedestal to archive, but it's eye-to-eye archiving, where we're thinking about each other's stories as sacred, but not necessarily elevated in a way. And so those are some of the ways that I've thought about this particular archive from a querying perspective.
Laura, Emily?
Yeah, I can just add also a few thoughts, because I always, when I think about querying archives, I always need to think of Joan Nessel, like the co-founder of the Lesbian History Archives in New York, because she had those notes on radical archiving from a lesbian feminist perspective, like 10 points, what if you do like a radical queer archiving, what it should be like. And I also guess like already everybody mentioned a few of those points, but I guess also what I would like to highlight is that one important point is that every life is worthy of preservation or like being collected. And I guess that's also very important in difference to like institutionalized archives, and also that kind of knowledge which is collected, like it's always resisting all those dominant narratives, dominant historiography, and it's like all those marginalized stories which are collected. And then I also guess it's quite important that we are like a real active part of the like present and future also. And there's this understanding of a queer temporality, I guess, because the past we are like collecting is always like connected to the present and future, and we always try like to support movements, political movements which are like now happening, which are imagining like another future, like a radical left perspective or something. And I guess it's quite nice to think this queer temporality, because you can take stuff from the past and then people come today and see that and have new ideas. Hey, how can we do that? So I guess it's, for me, those 3 points, I guess, are quite queer. And also this, like coming to the space and feel welcomed and personal, because I'm also an academic, but in our archive are also a lot of non-academic people, and it's really like this community space. And I don't know that from any institutional archive. So it's quite nice. There's like no orders to go inside. So that's really nice, I guess.
Yeah, and that's a very powerful part of the queering of an archive, is truly making it open for all to be present in. Yeah. Emily, what are your thoughts?
Well, I was gonna, what Laura was saying, I think that's also a challenge at our archive. It's physically an intimidating space. You have to come to a university, find the building, come into this, perhaps intimidating space. So particularly Vince Lee, the head archivist of this collection, has, I think, made a lot of effort. Annually, we're present at the Pride tent with kind of a traveling exhibit to make sure that all of the guests at Pride, which in Houston is very, very large, know that that this is, hopefully they recognize that this is part of their history, and maybe will be inspired to come visit the collections and learn more about what's available. We also, Harrison mentioned the Banner Project, which is like a local community history sort of installation / exhibit, and we host that every year in our library. So, you know, you come in and I think you recognize it as like an inclusive space. Hopefully that's what we hope the students will feel. And then also partnering with our campus LGBTQ Resource Center, and students from that program work in our collections. So those are the students who are often working on these collections more generally. And then the other thing that came to mind, which I think Peter sort of mentioned about language and the sort of changes of language over time, how we're approaching that with this audio project is we're transcribing all of the label information. So we have both the contemporary description, and then we'll work closely with our metadata department, but then also we have an advisory board to hopefully use the sort of most inclusive and also findable language, because if we're using sort of esoteric terms that no one knows to search, then there's a big problem. So, you know, this is not my area of expertise, but, you know, surely there are things people were saying in the 70s that will seem obsolete to someone searching in 2020 or, you know, into the future. So we're trying to be thoughtful about our descriptive practices to hopefully include as many people looking for information as possible.
Yeah, it's interesting too, the way that y'all are framing the kinds of power that your institutional settings offer to bring people in are sometimes also barriers themselves, right? Whether it's an institution being identified as a gay institution primarily, or a university that might have a "do you belong here on this campus" vibe to it in a different way. And then senses of ownership from community, like with the Gregory School. And this is our archive, and there's this other thing that's now part of it. So those dynamics of inclusion are so interesting to see, just in the way y'all answered that question. Which is a great segue to another thought that we were having before we got to this panel about that acronym, LGBTQIAA, add something else depending on where we are in time, right? How do your collections and institutions manage the tension that that acronym actually represents? That there's something unifying us, even as there's lots of differences among us. I'm really curious to hear what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I think the unfortunate thing about, you know, someone having to lead projects like this is he who leads often that identity shapes what you get and what people think about it. So people already think that because it's named for Charles Law and we share the same identity of being Black gay men, that it's a Black gay male space. And so one of the first panels we did was about our annual Black Gay Pride we have here. And I was very intentional about making sure that there was a lesbian presence there. Moving forward, we have some ideas about how to include trans people, but the tension between the Black gay male and the Black lesbian is one that I wanted to really address within the framework of the Houston Black Pride. And so we had, you know, a really prominent person who's been in the community for a long time as a Black lesbian to be a part of that panel, and to say, when we say we want to collect things that happened around Black Pride, we want to collect them from the whole community. And so bridging that gap intentionally is something I'm always thinking about, because I used to always ask, you know, like, why do lesbians not party with us? You know, that's just a question that when I was very young and coming out, I was like, why is everything so separate? It felt like everything was a niche thing. And as I got older, I kind of understood how people were just creating home, creating community with people that were most like them. But I also saw opportunities for overlap, and those things were kind of hard to force. Once we had become, you know, it was a habit just to be around people that were most like you. It just affected us in other spaces. And so my kind of work around it is just to be intentional about when I bring up a topic like we want to use sub words as buzzwords to bring. So we have one we're going to do around politics and activism. And I want that one to be led from the framework of a Black trans woman. And so using that identity to say we're talking about politics, but also Black trans women are included in this particular project. So just finding ways to make sure that each identity is represented. And what I'm trying not to do is just make everything has everybody, because what happens then is some conversations don't have the capacity to really address some identities, and it feels kind of like weird, right? It feels like you just have me here to have me here, and why am I here? And so I'm being very thoughtful about the fact that there are some identities just doesn't make sense for some conversations, and that's not exclusion, that's specificity, right? And so that's kind of how I'm looking at it.
Yeah, also for us, for the Spinnboden, I guess, or also from my perspective, is I guess it's also a matter of perspective, because if you look in, for example, in the past, also in our archives, you will find like a lot of overlapping fights of all different identities from the spectrum, from the queer spectrum. And I always have this very broad understanding also of lesbianism or lesbian lives, because it can be cis women, it can be trans women, non-binary lesbians, it can be trans masculinities, butches, femmes, asexual lesbians, I don't know. And I guess also what I kind of want to highlight is that in our collection you can find all those different types, I guess, of lesbians, and which are also speaking like to many of the letters, and also like, for example, all the alliances in the beginning of the 70s with the gay men, they were quite big, because they were like doing all the stuff after, like in the 71, 72 in West Berlin, like the gay men and lesbian women were together, but then lesbians split up to the feminist movements and didn't do anything anymore with gay men. But that's also not true, because there were always lesbians like alliance oriented and not that much involved in lesbian separatist politics. So I guess it's always, I guess I would love to that it's always the work of the archives to make that visible, all those details and complexity of the history, because there were always everybody involved and a lot of like overlapping different kinds of struggles. So yeah.
Thank you for your answers, Birgit, because they are so specific and detailed, and I'm afraid I can only talk about these issues in a more abstract or general way, you know, because I think, I mean, as necessary and urgent identity politics are, they also constitute a problem of sorts, you know, in several ways. Or there's a limit to the discourse of identity politics. Or I think we also must ask ourselves the question, when is the right time to use them for, you know, for the political struggle, for fights, for creating solidarity, but also, especially if when we work in a queer environment, when is the time to maybe leave identity politics behind and to think about the connections that we have in different terms than a subject position. But that's really a very general remark that needs to be translated, I think, for each and every context. You know, I'm very, I mean, passionately, and I think our whole place, Schwules Museum, engaged in the question of, is there a we, are we a community? Is our community just imaginary? And of course, we are asking this question in a very specific historical moment in 2020. You know, and Lara also already pointed out to the history of the 70s, where similar questions were posed in a different way. What I want to say is, you know, in the Western world, say, we obviously do have a phenomenon, and many people have been writing about this, of homonormativity. And we do know that, you know, for certain queer folks, life in neoliberalism is much easier, you know, for cis white gay men and also lesbian women, life structurally is easier than for many other queer groups and people. And I think that means for queer solidarity, that means this is really an ethical choice. You know, we might not if you think about, say, a certain history of liberation, we might not suffer, we talking about gay white men in this case, from the same sort of discrimination that we did 20 years ago. And we have gay marriage and we have anti-discrimination laws, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like mainstream society offer us a certain opportunity of passing that we can say yes or no to, but we can also make an ethical choice and say, no, we want to, you know, demonstrate queer solidarity with all queer groups and not just get, you know, use the ticket that is being offered to us. I guess that's one of the comments that's important to me. And maybe just two additional things from a more research perspective concerning the archive. This goes a little bit also to what Lara was speaking about. I think to approach the question of sexuality or gender from different queer perspectives is of course much richer and so much more interesting, you know, to find out something about the construction of it, the culture of it, the politics of it. So you need a multi-perspective approach in order to do justice to these phenomena. Having said that, a last point that I want to make, and I think Harrison also already mentioned that, I do also think at the same time there is a specificity to different queer groups. And I think this specificity should also be respected. You know, there are differences between gay and lesbian culture, for example, and that's not a bad thing. You know, I can also exist in different communities at the same time.
I don't think I have anything. I think this is a wonderful conversation. I would just say, like, I think we do recognize in our collection that we are overrepresentative of sort of the white gay male experience. And I think that has, you know, everything to do with privileges afforded historically, and also kind of what Harrison was talking about earlier with like a history of comfort with archiving yourself. Like that is you know, I think that is why these are really amazing and robust collections, because people were actively archiving their own history in these groups. So, I mean, I just think what was said is already really wonderful, but I think that we do acknowledge that we have, you know, Houston is an extremely diverse city, and our collection doesn't necessarily represent that right now.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you offered the segue to place and the importance of place, Emily, because that's the other thing that's really interesting about this conversation, is that it matters where we're doing our work and the geopolitical context, the history. So I hope that the four of you could speak a little bit to that piece, because Berlin and Houston, very different metropolitan, global, cosmopolitan cities.
I do think for us, and like for this radio program in particular, I think a lot of times in the US, queer history gets sort of distilled to like LA, San Francisco, and New York, and it's as if, you know, there was nothing in between, which is obviously not true. And there's like this really rich history all over the country, but, you know, here in Houston, I think the radio programs in particular that started in the 70s speak to this active and vibrant community that was really drawing in and a lifeline to a lot of people. And I think that's why it's going to be a super valuable resource to researchers, because, you know, so often you really have like these like limited views, and what's been preserved so far really only represents a really small, an important but small portion of like kind of the greater story. So I think being in an extremely conservative state in a, you know, the Deep South, that all colors people's experiences. So I think for the, you know, you can't escape the importance of place. And there were some pretty significant, you know, protest movements that took place here. So I think hearing sort of firsthand accounts of those experiences will be extremely valuable.
Yeah, I definitely feel the same way about the element of being from the South and this being in the South, because that contextualizes that intersection of being both Black and LGBTQ that may be very different, you know, from other Black LGBTQ people in other parts of the world. And so I think that it being here in Houston is really, really great, because I love Houston, of course. But I love that it's a Southern initiative. I really like that. And I think that it's going to speak to how we do things in the South, and how things show up in the South. I think the archive is going to do a really good job of showing that. Like, I was thinking one day about one of the elements is drag. We want to think about drag and how drag is different from place to place, and just how a collection of just drag queens would be different for a Houston archive than it would be somewhere else. And so I do think that I like the element that is located in Houston because of that Southern element.
Yeah, I can say a few things about Berlin. You know, it's the largest queer city in Germany. It's one of the largest queer cities in Europe, as we know. Its history goes back to the 19th century. In fact, you know, some scholars think of the German-speaking world as one of the cultural contexts of the birth of the modern concept of homosexuality and sexual science, medicine, and law. You know, Berlin had figures like Magnus Hirschfeld, a doctor and queer activist, a German Jewish who left Nazi Germany in the 30s. So yes, there's a lot of, you know, legacy, obviously, to the city. And for sure, I mean, I take it as our responsibility to do justice to this legacy. Maybe to make this a little bit more complicated, you know, as great as it is, it's also a burden in a sense, because this is the world also, as we know, in a pop cultural translation of cabaret or Berlin Babylon. So a lot of visitors that come to our place expect to display exactly that, you know. And while we're not necessarily opposed to do the job, that's of course a very mainstreamed version of queer historiography. So we also want to, you know, tell the stories of, say, domestic queer lives in post-war Berlin, or of queer life in the divided city during the Cold War, both in West and East Germany and Berlin. And but maybe a side note on the cliche of, you know, the queer Berlin, that can also be an advantage sometimes in terms of funding. So for example, I do believe that the fact that we are getting state funding now for 10 years, you know, so our utilities, our salaries are guaranteed by the state of Berlin, are being paid for with tax money. And I think this has a lot to do because, of course, the administration of Berlin is very aware of the fact how much queerness belongs to the brand of Berlin as a city. You know, for example, when you arrive at Tegel Airport, you see comic pictures of kissing women and men, or the public transport system of Berlin, the BVG, uses that in its advertisement campaign. So we are kind of like one of the resources, you know, for that myth about Berlin. Maybe just a last word. In my mind, you know, Berlin has never been, and you know, I think when we talk or think about the past, it really is also a myth, because I do believe that Berlin has never been more cosmopolitan than it is in the present. So I think what we've witnessed as a development of diversification in the city since the 1990s, and especially in the past 10 or 15 years, is completely on a different scale of what Berlin might have been in the 20s or 30s, you know. So we do have a global queer culture in the city. We have many queer people from Southern Europe, from Eastern Europe, from the Middle East, from the Americas, that come to Berlin and discover it as their queer home. And obviously, this is also a community that we are trying to get in touch with, that we do outreach work to make them, you know, to make the Schwules Museum and Archive also a place for them.
Yeah, I guess what I can add is that it's very interesting in the Spinnboden. If you look at the collection, what is missing, and then you can also get, I guess, some sense about the regionality or locality, because it's a lot about like the Western German, Western European, US, like lesbian lesbian movement in the 70s, and of course there's a lot from the 20s, but there's a whole lot of missing from the 30s, 40s, 50s, and early 60s. And then also we don't have much from Eastern Europe. And it's very interesting because when people are coming and asking about some like stuff which is not in the focus of the group who founded the archive, you get directly to all these archival absences which are pretty connected to the history of the group who founded the archive. So I guess it's quite interesting. And we are now also trying to reach out more to those archival absences. And I hope we will fill those a little bit in the next years. And then also what I found interesting is that I guess for Harrison and Emily, those collections seem to me like quite local in a way, but I have to say the Spinnboden is like doesn't have that quite a focus on Berlin, for example. We are like really trying to collect everything we can get. And I guess for the 70s, 80s, it's clearly like West Berlin and also Western Germany, but for the 20s and then also now from the 90s on, it's quite different, but you can still see those reflections from the 70s and 80s, and that's quite interesting also.
Thank you all. It's very interesting to hear the different ways that where you are truly deeply impacts the way that you imagine your work and the histories that you feel burdened in some cases, obliged, enabled to bear forward, and the work that you need to do to keep exploring around that. Right? That's really wonderful to hear. So I'd like now to turn to some questions that have come from our audience today. And there's lots of deep and thoughtful work that's gone into these. So I'm going to try to do justice to them by pulling them together a little bit as a conversation piece. And one of those conversation pieces is in fact about doing justice, right? So there's one question that comes from the perspective of looking at how Anne Frank's sexuality has been treated in the media recently, and raises the issue of like, how can we do justice to a past figure's identity through the archival evidence that we have available about them? But similar to that is another question about studying the past, where it's about doing justice in a different way to a group of people, where we might have, say, a picture of queer Weimar Berlin, but one that focuses in large part on gay male lives. And the question is, what about other lives that intersect with that space, and how to think about that? Do we justify focusing on the gay male portion of queer Weimar Berlin or not? So in so many ways, both of these questions raise a much deeper one about how do we do justice to the people whose lives we resurface, either as archivists collecting things or as artists and researchers representing them in the present day. And I hope that y'all can speak to that.
I can say maybe a few things about the Weimar Berlin aspect of that question. You know, on a more general level, as I said previously, I think that both is legitimate. So to have a, you know, queer inclusive approach, but also at the same time study very specific contexts and cultures. I think we shouldn't do the one at the expense of the other. So as important as it is for an institution to expand and diversify and become inclusive, I do believe at the same time it is legitimate to be very specific about a research project. Having said that, Weimar Berlin, of course, offers many, many, many examples beyond a gay male white experience. Just to name two things, and Lara has probably more to say about this, you know, we had a very, very rich trans culture in the 1920s with their own publication, Das Dritte Geschlecht, the third sex. Magnus Hirschfeld, who I mentioned earlier, Institute for Sexual Sciences, was basically a community center, you know, that also gave advice, medical advice, financial support, You know, many functions that we today expect from our queer community centers were already based in that institute. So it was not an institute for gay men, quite the opposite. So we do have, you know, I would use that language, a rich culture of non-binary and trans already in Weimar, Berlin. So the material is there, the context is there, you know, then it's an individual research decision what I do want to focus on. Similar things can of course be said for the lesbian culture. The 20s, for example, showed a richer public lesbian life than contemporary Berlin in a certain sense, where we have, you know, no bars left at all. And, you know, this is a big discussion, of course, about the public space, the relationship of women to public space, about economic power, et cetera, et cetera. But certainly, if we're talking about Weimar Republic, the material is there for sure.
I'll say related to that, kind of opening it up to more identities, something that happened to me very early on was we started doing oral history stories for Charles Law, and we wanted to get to know anyone who knew Charles Law, right? And so as we were getting I was sharing with this just in a broad conversation with a bunch of people what we were working on, and a very close friend of mine, actually is a mentor of mine, was like, why didn't you ask me? And I'm like, because you're straight, you're like a straight man. Why would I ask you about Charles Law? And he was like, well, I have you know, I was very good friends with Charles Law. And we had these salon dinners where we all got together and talked. And I felt like I had been slapped in the face. But it really woke me up to understand that I think what Laura was saying, there are these overlapping opportunities that we don't think about when we kind of, or we don't zoom out and kind of see these things. So that was my very first, I was thinking about being inclusive, of course, of all of the acronyms that we mentioned earlier, but I had not even thought about beyond extending it beyond that, and truly probably had shaped myself into a corner of what we were trying to say the library was already doing. And so that was just reminded me that we don't know who knew who, and we don't know who might have what, and who's people's families, and who sang in the choir together. And so, you know, Charles Law played the piano for a church, and so who was at the church? And so it just opened us up to say, okay, we're doing an oral history project really of who knew Charles Law. And so that was just a very big learning opportunity for me, and has stuck with me since that happened.
I just had a thought on this question of how do we do justice, because I don't know if that is possible in the way of like doing justice for the person who donated something, because as soon as they get it out of their hands, researchers will like have their own perspective on that material, and that's also kind of the thing why people are also hesitant about donating. I mean, in our archive, it's a case because it's also kind of like political, because if you're like too queer, like some lesbians won't give their stuff to our archives because they're afraid we are not lesbian anymore and stuff. So there's also this thing of like, I don't know if you can really do justice in that way, because I guess it's just, you also have to let go, and then every person will have their perspective, every generation, and then it's, I guess you just need this sense of what Harrison also said, of this intergenerational stuff and passing on, and also let it go, and then see what future generations will do with that. So that's also maybe another way of framing justice then, but yeah, I don't know, you can't control how to look at something.
Emily, thoughts on that?
Well, I do think it's really interesting. You know, there is the letting go is huge, because you really have no control over what's going to be, how your work's going to be used. And certainly I think there's like this, you know, you don't want to ascribe identities to someone who, you know, sort of in retrospect, which I think is another real challenge that people face. yeah, so I think, just kind of moving ahead with sensitivity as much as possible. And yeah, I think the silences are also somewhat unavoidable. Like, and also, I think, for example, UH is very lucky that the Gregory School and Harrison are here to address the silences that are for sure present in, so it has to be more than one institution can't do it. Like, it has to be a patchwork of institutions kind of hopefully working in collaboration, and hopefully being sensitive to like maybe the best fit for any given collection, which I think is, you can't, I don't think this is the problem, but you can't be greedy and be the vacuum that just says like, but this is ours, like you have to also think about like, where does this fit and where will people find it and where will it have like the best kind of context and impact.
Yeah. And speaking of moving on with this kind of hopeful sense of we are an ecosystem of culture curators, preservers, and storytellers. That is a great note to end on. I'm so sorry that we could not get to every question that came from the Q&A, but with that, I would like to thank all of our panelists for their expertise and insight today, and to our audience for their attention and questions. And I'm grateful to hand the screen back over to Grant.
Yes, thank you very much, Brian, for moderating this discussion. And thank you very much to all of our panelists, Peter, Laura, Harrison, and Emily. This was just a fascinating and great discussion. And thank you to everyone who joined us this afternoon or this evening if you're in Europe. Yeah, I will put in the chat really quick for our online exhibition for you to check out, and to go to our website, which is goethe.de/Houston, for all of our events in our Queer as German Folk Goes Digital series, or you can find us on Facebook and Instagram. So once again, thank you very much to everyone, and I hope you enjoy your Friday and the weekend.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.